George Burns has co-starred with a lot of people, including himself this time around, and Oh God, You Devil from Warner Brothers. Have you known who were agents who really did have a kind of a devilish quality like that?
George Burns was widely regarded as one of the nicest men in Hollywood. With his trademark cigar, gentle smile, and effortless wit, he spent nearly a century making audiences laugh. To the public, he was the kind of entertainer who never started feuds, never burned bridges, and rarely had a bad word to say about anyone. But sometimes, the most polite people are the ones who keep their disappointments hidden the longest. Behind the image of a gracious old gentleman was a lifetime of frustrations, private grievances, and opinions he rarely shared out loud. George Burns almost never criticized fellow performers in public. Instead, he chose silence. But silence doesn't always mean forgiveness. Throughout a career that stretched across generations of entertainment, there were a handful of people Burns never truly respected. They were beloved stars, comedy legends, and household names. Audiences adored them. Hollywood celebrated them. Yet behind the scenes, George Burns often saw something very different. And the first name on that list may surprise you more than any other: Milton Berle. Today, Berle is remembered as the man who helped turn television into America's favorite form of entertainment, known as Mr. Television. He became one of the most influential performers of the 20th century. He stepped onto a stage as a young boy and appeared in dozens of silent films, long before becoming one of the biggest stars in the country. By the late 1940s, his hit program, Texaco Star Theater, had become a national sensation. Millions of American families reportedly bought their first television sets just to watch Milton Berle perform. Audiences loved his larger-than-life personality, outrageous costumes, and boundless energy. From the outside, it looked like the perfect success story. But behind the spotlight, there was another story, one that many people in show business quietly whispered about. Within comedy circles, Berle carried a reputation that never completely disappeared. For years, fellow performers accused him of borrowing jokes, routines, and ideas from other comedians. It became one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets. Many people laughed it off as part of a legend. George Burns did not. Burns came from a different era. An era where originality mattered, where performers spent years refining their material, and where a comedian's act was considered a reflection of their character. He devoted decades to crafting routines with his beloved wife, Gracie Allen, carefully polishing every line and every pause. To George, a joke wasn't just a joke. It was hard work. It was creativity. It was something earned. Watching another performer rise to the very top while carrying a reputation for using other people's material was something Burns found difficult to accept. He rarely spoke about it publicly, but those who knew him understood how deeply he valued authenticity. For George Burns, the issue wasn't simply professional, it was personal. It was about respect. And it marked the beginning of one of the quietest yet most enduring resentments in classic Hollywood history. When Lucille Ball passed away in 1989, she left behind far more than a television legacy. She left behind an empire. Generations of comedians would study her work, admire her timing, and attempt to recreate the magic she brought to the screen. Decades later, her life would even inspire the Oscar-nominated film Being the Ricardos. To millions of fans, Lucy was the fearless redhead who changed television forever. But behind that remarkable success story was a side of Lucille Ball that many people never saw. And according to those who worked around her, it was a side that George Burns found almost impossible to tolerate. The contrast between the two comedy legends could not have been greater. George Burns built his career on ease. His performances felt natural, effortless, and relaxed. He believed comedy worked best when it flowed organically, allowing performers room to breathe and audiences time to enjoy the moment. A raised eyebrow, a quiet pause, or a slow puff from his cigar could earn a bigger laugh than an elaborate routine. Lucille Ball operated very differently. Behind the scenes at Desilu Studios, she ruled with an intensity that surprised many people who expected her to be as playful as the character they watched on television every week. Former cast members, directors, and crew members often described a workplace driven by relentless perfectionism. Mistakes were not encouraged. They were unacceptable. Lucy carried the enormous responsibility of running one of Hollywood's most successful television studios, and she demanded absolute precision from everyone around her. Rehearsals could stretch endlessly. Scenes were repeated again and again until every movement felt exactly right. Nothing was left to chance. Every stumble, every facial expression, every laugh and every moment of physical comedy was carefully planned long before the cameras started rolling. Improvisation was practically forbidden. If an actor missed a cue or altered a line, they quickly learned just how demanding Lucille Ball could be. To many, that level of control was the secret behind her brilliance. To George Burns, it looked like something else entirely. Friends of Burns later suggested that he viewed Lucy's management style not as dedication, but as an exhausting obsession with control. While he respected her achievements and acknowledged her enormous impact on television history, he reportedly had little interest in working inside the high-pressure world she created. For George, comedy was supposed to bring joy. For Lucy, comedy was a machine that had to run perfectly, and that fundamental difference may explain why one of Hollywood's gentlest entertainers chose to keep his distance from the queen of television comedy. George Burns never needed a room full of writers to make people laugh. His success came from something much harder to manufacture: natural chemistry, perfect timing, and an instinctive understanding of human nature. While Burns remained polite whenever he crossed paths with Bob Hope at Hollywood events, those closest to him knew he viewed Hope's carefully engineered comedy machine with quiet skepticism. To George, comedy was supposed to feel genuine. Hope's endless stream of jokes, produced by teams of hired writers, often felt more like a business operation than an art form. And that brings us to another legendary comedian whose success George Burns found even more difficult to admire: W.C. Fields. To movie historians, Fields remains one of the greatest comic performers America ever produced. Alongside Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, his name sits comfortably among the giants of classic comedy. Critics praised his flawless timing, his unforgettable delivery, and the grumpy screen persona that became his trademark. His rise was remarkable. Born in Philadelphia, Fields left home as a teenager to pursue a career in entertainment. By his early 20s, he had already become one of the most successful vaudeville performers in the world, dazzling audiences with his juggling skills and stage presence. His popularity eventually carried him to Broadway, where he became one of the highest-paid performers of his era. When talking pictures arrived, Fields found an even larger audience. His distinctive voice, sharp wit, and memorable characters helped turn films like It's a Gift, The Bank Dick, and Never Give a Sucker an Even Break into enduring classics. Audiences loved the cynical charm he brought to every performance, but the man behind the character was often far less charming. In fact, many people who worked with Fields claimed there was very little difference between his on-screen personality and his real one. While George Burns was known as one of the most optimistic men in Hollywood, Fields carried a reputation for bitterness that followed him everywhere. Burns genuinely enjoyed people. He loved the camaraderie of show business and maintained a positive outlook throughout his long career. Fields seemed to view the world through a much darker lens. Stories about his hostility became legendary. He openly joked about disliking children, mocked social conventions, and developed a serious drinking problem that often made him unpredictable. At his worst, his alcoholism damaged both his health and his professional relationships. As the two men crossed paths throughout their vaudeville and Broadway years, Burns reportedly grew increasingly uncomfortable with Fields' behavior. While fans imagined comedians sharing laughs behind the curtain, insiders described a very different reality. George believed comedy should lift people up. Fields often seemed determined to tear everything down. To Burns, Fields wasn't simply playing the role of a lovable grouch. He was a deeply unhappy man whose negativity poisoned every room he entered. Although George rarely criticized fellow entertainers publicly, friends understood how strongly he felt. He respected Fields' talent. He simply couldn't respect the man behind it. And if W.C. Fields tested George Burns' patience, the next comedian pushed him even closer to his limit: Jerry Lewis. For millions of Americans growing up after World War II, Jerry Lewis was comedy itself. Loud, energetic, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore, he brought a completely different style of humor to the stage. Together with Dean Martin, he formed one of the most successful comedy teams in entertainment history, filling theaters and dominating television. Their chemistry was electric. Martin played the smooth, handsome, straight man. Lewis supplied the chaos. Audiences couldn't get enough of it. After their famous split, Lewis proved he could succeed on his own. Films like The Bellboy, The Ladies' Man, and The Nutty Professor cemented his reputation as a creative force. Around the world, especially in France, he was celebrated not merely as a comedian but as a serious artist. Yet behind the applause and admiration was another side of Jerry Lewis that many people found difficult to handle, and George Burns was one of them. Where Burns relied on subtlety, Lewis embraced excess. Where Burns valued patience, Lewis often demanded control. Industry insiders frequently described Lewis as brilliant but exhausting, a perfectionist with a fragile ego and a famously explosive temper. For a man as calm and easygoing as George Burns, working around that kind of energy felt less like comedy and more like survival. By the early 1970s, Jerry Lewis had become something more than a comedian. To his fans, he was a genius. To his critics, he was a man whose talent was often overshadowed by his ego. Nothing symbolized that better than The Day the Clown Cried, the infamous 1972 film that became one of Hollywood's greatest mysteries. Lewis poured years of passion into the project, only for it to collapse under the weight of controversy and criticism. The film was never officially released, and Lewis himself spent decades refusing to let the public see it. For many observers, it was the clearest example of how his relentless pursuit of perfection could sometimes become self-destructive. And for George Burns, it reinforced everything that bothered him about Jerry Lewis. Burns belonged to a different generation of entertainers. He believed comedy should be simple, natural, and enjoyable for both audiences and performers. Throughout his long career, he avoided unnecessary drama and treated show business as a team effort built on mutual respect. Jerry Lewis often seemed to operate by an entirely different set of rules. His comedy was loud, explosive, and impossible to ignore. Off-stage, his reputation was just as intense. Numerous biographies and industry insiders described a man with a short temper, a fragile ego, and an overwhelming need to control every detail around him. Stories of shouting matches, creative conflicts, and difficult working relationships followed him for decades. To George Burns, that kind of behavior was exhausting. He admired skill, professionalism, and quiet confidence. Lewis, on the other hand, often appeared determined to dominate every room he entered. Even when the two occasionally crossed paths later in life, Burns reportedly kept his distance. He simply could not understand why someone so talented seemed to create so much tension wherever he went. But if Jerry Lewis irritated George Burns with his ego and chaos, the next comedian challenged something even more fundamental, his entire philosophy of comedy. Don Rickles. To modern audiences, Rickles is remembered as one of the greatest insult comics who ever lived. Armed with lightning-fast comebacks and fearless confidence, he built a legendary career by doing something most comedians avoided, making fun of the audience. And surprisingly, people loved him for it. From Las Vegas nightclubs to television appearances and Hollywood films, Rickles became famous for turning insults into entertainment. Yet beneath the laughter was a style of comedy that George Burns never fully embraced. Because where Rickles saw comedy as a playful attack, Burns believed comedy should always leave people smiling, and that difference would become impossible for George to ignore.